I didn't believe in love at first sight until I sat next to him on the train from Boston to New York. I never thought a train ride could change anything. Boston's early morning chill lingered in the air as I stepped onto the platform, coffee in one hand, laptop bag slung over my shoulder. The train to New York was nearly empty, the hum of the engines blending with the distant clatter of commuters. I found my seat by the window, sighing as I watched the city blur behind me, thinking about deadlines and meetings and everything I had to do before the day ended. Then he appeared, a man with a scruffy jacket, tousled hair, and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of someone who had traveled too far and seen too much. He asked if the seat next to me was taken. I shook my head, trying not to stare too obviously, though curiosity bubbled in my chest. "Thanks," he said, settling down, his bag tucked neatly at his feet. He glanced out the window, but I could tell he was already aware of me, of the quiet space I was creating for myself in that corner. Minutes passed, the train rolling steadily, but he didn't speak. I fiddled with my pen, scribbling notes, pretending not to notice the way he shifted slightly closer when the train jolted. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Boston to New York every week?" I nodded, startled by the question. "Yeah, work mostly. And you?" "Something like that," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It's nice to have company sometimes." I smiled back, realizing how lonely the rides had felt before. There was a softness in his voice, a rhythm in the way he spoke that made the hours seem shorter, the cities feel closer. We started talking, carefully at first, about trivial things, the weather, the train delays, favorite coffee spots, but soon the conversation deepened. Books he loved, music I couldn't stop listening to, dreams we weren't sure we'd ever chase. Hours passed unnoticed. The train rocked gently, the scenery shifting from concrete to suburbs, from suburbs to wide open stretches of highway, and still we talked. By the time we pulled into New York, I felt as if I'd known him for a lifetime, though we'd only met that morning. I wanted to say something, anything, to mark the moment, but the words got stuck in my throat. He smiled politely as we stepped onto the platform, adjusting his bag. "See you next week?" he asked casually, though his eyes betrayed a hopefulness I couldn't ignore. I nodded, heart racing, unsure if fate or coincidence would bring him back, but secretly hoping it would. As the crowd swallowed him up, I realized something simple and terrifying. I was already thinking about next week, about the next ride, about the stranger on the train who had managed to carve space in my mind and my heart in a way I didn't think anyone could. And for the first time in a long time, I couldn't wait to see where the tracks would lead. Would you talk to a stranger on a long train ride or stay quiet? The next week, I found myself at the same platform, coffee in hand, heart beating a little faster than usual. I told myself it was just routine, just another ride to New York. But a tiny part of me was already scanning the crowd, hoping. And then I saw him, leaning against the railing, bag slung over his shoulder, that same easy smile he had flashed last week. My stomach fluttered, and I had to remind myself to breathe. He caught my eye, and just like that, the world seemed a little smaller, the platform a little warmer. "Hey," he said casually, though his tone carried a subtle excitement, as if he had been waiting to say it all week. "Hi," I replied, letting the smile creep across my face. He slid into the seat next to mine, and the space felt right, natural, as if we'd been sitting side by side for years instead of days. The train started moving, the city falling behind us, and the conversation began again. This time, we didn't start with small talk. We dove into the things that mattered, the little pieces of ourselves we usually kept tucked away, music that made us feel alive, books that we returned to again and again, the quiet dreams we were afraid to chase. He laughed at a story I told about a coffee mishap in Boston, and the sound made my chest warm. I noticed the way he looked at me when he spoke, eyes focused, attentive, like he wanted to memorize every detail. Every time our hands brushed reaching for our bags or adjusting papers, I felt a spark, a tingle that made the hum of the train fade away. We talked about the city skyline as it approached New York, how each building seemed to tell a story, how the train felt like a bridge between the lives we led and the lives we imagined. And though I wanted to say something, anything that would capture how much I was already thinking about him, the words stuck. When we finally arrived, I lingered a little, reluctant to step onto the crowded platform. "See you next week?" he asked, a playful smile tugging at his lips. I nodded, my heart skipping. "Yes," I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. As I watched him disappear into the crowd, I realized the train had become more than a commute. It had become a place where stories began, where laughter and quiet moments built bridges between strangers, where anticipation and hope intertwined with every mile. I thought about him the entire week, the tilt of his head when he laughed, the careful way he listened, the warmth in his eyes. And I knew, without saying it aloud, that I was already waiting for the next ride, for the next 4 hours, for the continuation of something that felt both impossible and inevitable. The train, once a mundane journey, had become a promise, a rhythm we were both starting to follow without realizing it. Would you start opening up to a stranger so quickly or stay guarded? By the third week, I caught myself arriving early, my bag heavier with anticipation than anything I really needed. The platform felt different, smaller, warmer somehow because I knew he would be there, and he was, leaning casually against the railing, hands in his pockets, that same crooked smile I couldn't forget. "Hey," he said, sliding into the seat next to mine before I could even fully settle. My pulse raced at the familiarity, the effortless comfort we were building without even acknowledging it. The train began to move, and for a moment we were silent, watching Boston fade behind us. Then he reached for a notebook I'd set down. "You ride every week?" he asked, fingers brushing mine, just enough to make me shiver. "Something like that," I replied, heart thumping. I didn't mention that lately. My thoughts had been more about him than anything I'd written. We fell into conversation again, but this time it felt different, deeper, more personal. He asked about the city I grew up in, the one I'd left behind, and I found myself telling him things I'd never told anyone else. I watched his expression, the way his eyes softened when I laughed, how he tilted his head when I paused, waiting for him to respond. At one point, our knees touched, a brief, accidental brush that made my stomach flip. I glanced at him, expecting nothing, and found him looking at me with the faintest trace of a smile, as if he had felt the same spark. We didn't speak of it, but the silence afterward was charged, heavy with words unsaid and feelings unspoken. The scenery blurred into the suburbs, then forests, then wide stretches of highway. Our conversation wandered too, dreams we had abandoned, the kind of music that made us feel alive, memories that were both painful and precious. Every laugh, every pause, every glance created a rhythm I was already addicted to. When New York approached, I realized I didn't want to get off the train, not because of the city, but because of him. I wanted more time, more miles, more conversations that stretched endlessly. Next week, he asked casually, but I heard the hope in his voice. I nodded quickly, heart thundering. Yes, definitely. And as we stepped onto the bustling platform, the crowd swallowing him up, I caught myself smiling like an idiot, already counting the days until the next ride, already imagining 4 more hours of laughter, confessions, accidental touches, and shared silences. The train had become more than a commute. It had become a heartbeat, a place where time slowed and emotions sharpened, where strangers could feel like home. And I knew without a doubt that I was falling. For him, for the moments between us, for something I couldn't yet name but could feel in every fiber of my being. By the time I reached the street, the city lights were glowing and my heart was somewhere back on the train, racing alongside his. Would you admit your feelings if someone made your heart race like this on a train? By the 4th week, I realized I had been counting the days, circling the calendar, my mornings suddenly brighter just knowing he would be there. I arrived at the platform early, shivering slightly in the crisp air, clutching my coffee like a lifeline. And there he was, leaning casually against the railing, hair tousled, eyes scanning the crowd until they found me. That smile, small, knowing, impossible to ignore, made my chest tighten. "Hey," he said softly, sliding into the seat beside me. No hesitation this time. The seat felt like it had been waiting for him all week. I couldn't stop smiling, my fingers brushing my notebook nervously as I tried to act casual. The train began its steady hum, and the world outside faded. We started talking immediately, as if the weeks of silence between our meetings didn't matter at all. This time, our conversation slipped easily from books and music into moments we rarely shared with anyone else, childhood fears, guilty pleasures, dreams too fragile to speak aloud in public. His laughter was low, infectious, carrying warmth that seemed to wrap around me. Every glance felt loaded with unspoken meaning, every brush of his hand against mine sending a jolt straight through me. It was like the train itself had disappeared, leaving only him, me, and the charged space between us. At one point, he leaned closer, just enough for our shoulders to touch. The slightest contact, but it made me aware of my heartbeat, the rapid pulse in my wrists, the warmth spreading through my chest. I looked at him quickly, expecting nothing, and found him looking at me in the same way, curious, careful, longing. We talked about New York as we approached, the skyline appearing over the horizon, buildings like silent witnesses to our growing connection. I wanted to reach out, to let him know how much I was thinking about him, how these 4-hour rides had become the highlight of my week, but the words wouldn't come. When the train slowed, I felt a pang of disappointment. I didn't want to leave, didn't want to let go of the closeness, of the conversation, of the quiet tension that had been building for weeks. "See you next week?" he asked casually, though the lift in his eyebrows betrayed the hope behind the question. "Yes," I whispered, barely audible, heart racing. "Next week." As we stepped onto the platform, the bustling crowd swallowing him up, I realized that the anticipation, the waiting, the slow accumulation of moments was what made this connection so real. The train was more than steel and tracks. It was a stage for tiny confessions, glances, laughter, and touches that neither of us could fully name yet. Walking away, I felt the pull of him lingering, an invisible thread tugging at my heart. Every jolt of the train, every passing city, every week that brought us together made me realize something terrifying and exhilarating. I was already falling, and there was no stopping the momentum that had begun the first time I sat down in that corner seat. The train had become more than a route. It had become a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. Would you admit your growing feelings or let them build slowly? Week 5 arrived, and I was already on the platform before the sun fully rose. I clutched my coffee like it was a shield, trying not to let my anticipation show. The city was waking slowly around me, commuters rushing past, but I hardly noticed. All I could see was him, leaning against the railing, hair a little messier than usual, eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on me. That small smile, just for me, made my pulse spike. "Hey," he said softly, as if greeting an old friend. He slid into the seat beside me, and the familiar closeness made my chest ache with longing. I wondered if he felt it too, that invisible pull that had been growing week by week. The train rumbled forward, Boston falling behind, and our conversation picked up where it left off. This time, it was effortless, full of shared laughter and teasing, a rhythm that had become ours. We spoke about the little things that made us happy, coffee shops we loved, songs that lifted us, movies that made us cry, and then, without realizing it, we veered into territory more intimate, more personal. "I never tell anyone this," he said quietly, voice low, eyes focused on the window. "But I've always imagined what it would be like to meet someone and just click, like the world gets smaller just for a while." I felt my throat tighten, my heart racing. "I know exactly what you mean," I admitted softly, turning slightly to look at him. His green eyes met mine, searching, hopeful, and I felt a shiver run through me. Our hands brushed again, accidental, or maybe not, and a thrill shot through me. The simple touch was electric, a spark that seemed to ignite everything that had been quietly building over the past weeks. I wanted to hold his hand, to reach out, but the hesitation lingered, the fear of ruining something delicate holding me back. We laughed, we shared memories, we teased each other, and yet beneath it all, the tension simmered, unspoken and undeniable. I found myself watching his lips, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the subtle warmth that radiated from him, and I realized with a mixture of fear and excitement that I was falling faster than I expected. When New York approached, I felt that familiar pang. I didn't want to leave the seat beside him, the conversation, the closeness that had become so intoxicating. "Next week?" he asked, a faint teasing edge to his voice, but his eyes held the same hopeful intensity as always. "Yes," I said quickly, my voice catching. Next week. As we stepped onto the bustling platform, I felt the invisible thread connecting us stretch taut, pulling my heart toward him. The anticipation, the longing, the slow burning connection, it had become irresistible. The train was no longer just a commute, it was a rhythm, a heartbeat, a place where two strangers could become more than they ever expected. And I knew, with certainty, that I would be waiting for that seat beside him again, for the continuation of something that was quietly, beautifully unfolding. Would you act on feelings now, or wait for the right moment? Week 6 arrived, and I was already pacing the platform, coffee barely touched, heart hammering in my chest. The crisp morning air did nothing to calm me, and there he was, leaning casually against the railing, eyes scanning the crowd, until finally they found me. That little smile, the one that always caught me off guard, made everything else fade away. "Morning," he said, sliding into the seat beside me without hesitation. There was an ease between us now, a comfort that had been absent the first weeks, but underneath it was something stronger, anticipation, longing, attention neither of us had dared to name. The train lurched forward, Boston shrinking behind us, and we immediately fell into conversation. This week it felt different, more intentional, more daring. We laughed, teasing each other over silly habits, sharing favorite movies, favorite songs, and then somehow we began to talk about fears. Deep fears, secrets that weren't easy to admit. And yet I found myself sharing, trusting him without even thinking, because somehow he had earned it. At one point, the train jolted slightly and our hands touched. Just a fleeting brush. But it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through me. I glanced at him, heart racing, and he met my gaze. There was a spark there, unspoken but undeniable. We didn't speak of it, but the silence that followed was thick with possibility, with desire, with the weight of what neither of us dared to say. I found myself stealing glances at him, noticing the way his hair fell into his eyes, the curve of his smile when he laughed, the way he leaned slightly toward me when I spoke. Each small movement felt intimate, deliberate, magnetic. My chest ached with a strange combination of fear and longing. The cityscape blurred past, the suburbs giving way to highways, and still, we talked. Still, I felt the pull of him beside me. I wanted to reach for his hand, to bridge the gap, to let him know how badly I wanted more than these fleeting moments. But I hesitated, unsure if the timing was right, if this fragile rhythm we'd built could survive the abruptness of desire. When New York approached, I felt the familiar pang of disappointment. I didn't want to leave, didn't want to let go of the closeness, of the conversations, of the unspoken tension that had been building over weeks. "Next week?" he asked casually, though his eyes betrayed something stronger, a hope, a longing I felt mirrored in my own chest. "Yes," I whispered, unable to hide the catch in my voice. "Next week." And as he disappeared into the bustling crowd, I felt an ache that was both painful and thrilling. The train was no longer just a ride. It had become a heartbeat, a rhythm that I followed without realizing it. The anticipation, the longing, the small touches and shared silences, they had transformed a simple commute into something unforgettable, something I couldn't stop thinking about. And I knew deep down that this slow, quiet journey was only just beginning. Would you risk crossing the line with someone you've been slowly connecting with? Week 7 arrived and I felt it. The anticipation, the nervous excitement that made my fingers jitter even before I saw him. The platform seemed smaller somehow, more intimate, like the world had shrunk to fit just us and the train that carried us toward the city. And there he was, leaning against the railing, that familiar crooked smile tugging at my chest, eyes immediately finding mine. "Hey," he said, sliding into the seat beside me as if no time had passed. And somehow it felt like it hadn't. Every week this seat had become a refuge, a space where the outside world faded, leaving only the rhythm of the train, the scenery rushing past, and the growing electricity between us. We started talking, naturally effortlessly, like breathing. But this week, the conversation carried something unspoken, an undercurrent that neither of us dared to name. We laughed, shared stories, teased each other, but our eyes lingered just a little too long, fingers brushing when we reached for notebooks or coffee, hearts hammering against our chests. At one point, the train hit a small bump, and our hands collided deliberately this time. I felt my breath catch, the spark surging straight to my chest. He looked at me, not with embarrassment, but with that small, knowing smile, and I realized he felt it too. The tension between us was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. I stole glances at him when he wasn't looking, memorizing the line of his jaw, the curve of his lips when he laughed, the way his eyes softened in moments of quiet. Each detail made my chest ache with longing, a longing I could barely admit to myself, let alone to him. We talked about life outside the train, dreams, fears, the small things that made us who we were. And yet every word was colored by the unspoken, by the desire that hovered just beyond reach. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap with my hand, with my lips, with a confession, but I held back, afraid to disrupt the fragile rhythm we had built. As New York approached, I felt the familiar pang of disappointment. I didn't want to leave, didn't want the moment to end. But he turned slightly toward me, eyes holding mine, and whispered, "Next week." "Yes," I replied, heart thudding, voice barely audible. "Next week." And just like that, he disappeared into the bustling crowd, leaving me standing on the platform, heart racing, every nerve alive with the memory of 4 hours that felt like a lifetime. The train had become more than a commute. It had become a heartbeat, a rhythm I couldn't resist, a slow burn connection that grew stronger with every glance, every touch, every unspoken word. I realized with a mixture of fear and exhilaration that I was completely and utterly hooked. The anticipation was no longer just thrilling, it was intoxicating. And I knew that when the next week came, I wouldn't just be taking the train. I would be stepping into something that could change everything. Would you act on undeniable chemistry or wait for the perfect moment? Week 8 arrived, and I couldn't stop thinking about the train before I even stepped onto the platform. Every week felt like a countdown. And today, I was hyper-aware of every step, every movement. The platform hummed with early commuters, but all I saw was him, leaning casually against the railing, hair slightly mussed, that small, crooked smile reserved just for me. "Morning," he said, sliding into the seat beside me. This time, it wasn't just a greeting. There was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made my chest flutter and my stomach twist. The train lurched forward, and I realized how much I'd been longing for these 4 hours. We talked as usual, but today felt different. The jokes, the stories, the teasing, it all carried a subtle weight. Every glance lingered. Every brush of our fingers against notebooks or coffee cups felt deliberate, intentional, as if both of us were daring the other to notice. At one point, he leaned slightly closer, and the warmth from his shoulder pressed against mine. I tried to focus on the scenery outside, the skyline, the bridges, the shifting suburbs, but all I could think about was him, the nearness, the tension that had been building for weeks. I feel like I can talk to you about anything, he said quietly, eyes fixed on mine. It's strange, but comforting. I smiled, heart racing. I know, I feel the same way. The words slipped out before I could stop them, soft but honest. And the moment stretched, hanging between us, fragile yet electric. Our hands touched again, this time longer, deliberate, fingers brushing, tracing invisible patterns. I caught myself holding his gaze, noticing the softness in his eyes, the faint curve of his lips, the way the world seemed to shrink until it was just us. My pulse pounded in my ears. The train rattled on, the scenery a blur, but our conversation slowed. We were talking less, feeling more, caught in a rhythm of stolen glances, subtle touches, and quiet awareness. Every fiber of me wanted to close the distance, to reach for his hand, to let him know how impossible it had become to ignore this connection. When New York approached, I felt the familiar pang of wanting more, of wishing the ride would never end. He looked at me with that same hopeful expression, teasingly casual. Next week? Yes, I whispered, barely able to breathe. Next week. As he disappeared into the crowd, my chest ached with longing and anticipation. The train had become more than a commute. It was a pulse, a heartbeat, a space where emotions could bloom, where two strangers were slowly learning to recognize each other in a way that felt inevitable and inescapable. And I realized, with a mixture of excitement and nervous fear, that next week, next ride, might finally be the one where everything changes. Have you ever felt a connection that words couldn't fully describe? Week 9 arrived, and I felt a nervous excitement I couldn't shake. The platform felt electric, every step echoing with the anticipation I'd been carrying all these weeks. And there he was, standing just beyond the crowd, eyes scanning until they landed on me, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. My chest tightened, heart thumping like it had a rhythm of its own. Hey, he said, sliding into the seat beside me. No hesitation, no small talk, just that quiet magnetic ease that had become our rhythm. The train lurched forward, and suddenly the world outside didn't matter. Boston blurred into suburbs, suburbs into open highways, but all I could focus on was him. We started talking, but today the conversation felt almost secondary. We laughed and shared stories, but beneath it, every glance, every brush of our hands carried weight. He reached for his coffee, and our fingers touched just enough to make my pulse spike. I caught his eyes, and for a moment it felt like the air itself had thickened, holding us in suspended tension. I've been thinking about next week already, he said quietly, voice soft but loaded with meaning. I swallowed hard, heat rising to my cheeks. Me too, I admitted, almost whispering. The words felt reckless and true, like stepping over a line we had both danced around for weeks. At one point, he leaned closer, our shoulders touching fully this time. My breath caught, and I realized how much I'd been craving this nearness, this silent acknowledgement of what was building between us. Every nerve in my body buzzed with anticipation, every glance daring me to reach out. We talked about dreams, about fleeting hopes, about moments in life that had shaped us, but each word was colored by the undercurrent of longing. The slow pull towards something neither of us could fully name yet. I found myself imagining what it would be like to reach for his hand, to close the space that had been growing between us week after week. As New York approached, I felt the familiar ache of leaving, but it was sharper this time, tinged with the knowledge that the waiting had become unbearable. He looked at me, a faint grin playing on his lips, but his eyes were full of unspoken questions, hopes, and something more intense, something I was just beginning to recognize in myself. Next week, he asked, voice teasing but serious, and my heart nearly stopped. Yes, I whispered, voice catching in my throat. Next week. And as he disappeared into the bustling crowd, I realized I didn't just want the next ride. I wanted him. I wanted the next smile, the next laugh, the next brush of his fingers. The train was no longer just a journey between cities. It was a journey between hearts, a slow unraveling of something beautiful, fragile, and utterly irresistible. I walked into New York, every step echoing with longing, every thought consumed by the inevitable. Next week, next ride, next moment, when our connection might finally no longer be just unspoken tension. How long would you wait for someone you felt deeply connected to? Week 10 arrived, and I could barely contain the flutter in my chest as I stepped onto the platform. The train's familiar hum seemed louder, more urgent, as if it knew what this ride would bring. And there he was, standing against the railing, eyes immediately finding mine, smile that tugged at my heart like it had every week before. Morning, he said softly, sliding into the seat beside me. But this time, there was a difference. No hesitation, no restraint. Something had shifted. The air between us was charged, almost electric, like the quiet tension of the past weeks had finally reached a breaking point. The train began to move, and for the first time, words seemed unnecessary. We shared glances, brief touches, the kind of quiet intimacy that had built up over 10 weeks. My heart raced as his fingers brushed mine, deliberate and lingering, sending a thrill straight through me. I've been thinking about this all week, he said quietly, eyes locking with mine. About us, about sitting here, together. I can't keep pretending it's just a coincidence anymore. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. I feel the same way, I whispered, voice trembling with relief and excitement. The words hung in the air, fragile yet freeing, breaking the invisible barrier that had kept us just friends on a train. For the first time, our hands entwined naturally, confidently, and the warmth of his palm against mine sent a shiver down my spine. The city blurred past the window, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was the pulse of the connection we had nurtured, the unspoken longing that had finally been named. We laughed softly, sharing teasing remarks and quiet smiles, but now every glance carried new meaning. Every touch reaffirmed the connection we had both been feeling. I realized how much I had waited, how much I had hoped, and how utterly perfect it felt to finally let the feelings we'd been hiding surface. As New York approached, I felt no pang of disappointment. I didn't want to leave the train because I wasn't leaving him. I was stepping into something new, something real. The familiar rhythm of the ride had transformed into a rhythm of hearts, a journey we would continue together, mile after mile. Next week, he asked, voice playful but sincere, eyes sparkling with that same anticipation that had first made me notice him. Yes, I said, squeezing his hand, smiling like I hadn't smiled in years. Next week, and every week after that. The train slowed, and we stepped onto the platform, hand in hand, the crowd moving around us, oblivious to the quiet magic we had found. For 10 weeks, the journey had been about more than just a train. It had been about connection, trust, and the slow unfolding of love. And now, as we walked together through the streets of New York, I knew the ride was over, but the story was only just beginning. Would you finally confess your feelings after weeks of anticipation?